At the beginning of the 18th century, what is today the Trans-Mississippi United States consisted of three political regions, each controlled by a foreign power. By early in the 20th century, those areas were part of the United States and were broken into 22 political divisions, with the borders being essentially as they are today. The changes that occurred over that time are fascinating and are the subject of our Shaping the American West series of YouTube lectures. These lectures will look at the shaping of the American West using original maps from the period to help illustrate this complex subject. Period maps provide a couple of unique perspectives on this topic. First, there were lots of short-lived border changes, and these maps show us these transitory political divisions as they happened. But they also show us political configurations that didn't happen. This is because map publishers did not want their maps to be out of date. So if they thought a new political border was going to be drawn, they would add it to their map, and sometimes those borders were never officially created. These talks are our look at the changes of the American West from 1800 to the early 20th century. We will see that there were three main types of changes. First, there was the acquisition by the United States of what in 1800 were foreign lands. Then there was the introduction of territorial governments to previously unorganized territory, that is, lands with no formal government. Finally, we'll see the breaking up of these large territories into smaller territories and then states. Now, there were a number of different types of forces which triggered and shaped these changes. The most influential forces at work were economic ones. These were almost always at the bottom of where, when, and why political changes were made in the American West in this period. Another set of forces at work were political ones. While much of politics is intimately entwined with economics, there are other aspects to political actions, and such factors played an important role in the changes we will consider. Finally, there was also the insidious factor of prejudice. This runs through the entire story of these narratives, and it has three main components. First, there was the religious prejudice against Mormons, who were looked on with suspicion, to a great extent because of their belief in polygamy. This prejudice manifested itself in the persistent curtailment of Mormon power and lands by the federal government. Then there was also the widely held Anglo prejudice against Native Americans. This was manifested in the repeated and unconscionable taking away of Indian lands. Finally, of course, there was the prejudice against blacks. This manifested itself in the desperate and constant attempts to protect and expand slavery. As we shall see, these efforts played a seminal role in the shaping of the American West. So now let's turn to looking at these changes in the shape of the American West. This first lecture in our series will consider the Louisiana Purchase and the political development of those lands. Initially, the British colonies, which later became the United States, were limited to lands east of the Appalachian Mountains. With the victory in the French and Indian War in 1763, the British got control of all of North America east of the Mississippi, except for New Orleans and Florida. At that time, the American West consisted of the Trans-Appalachian region. At the turn of the century, the Trans-Mississippi West consisted of three political regions, all controlled by foreign powers. There was Louisiana, which was French territory. Then there was New Spain or Mexico, which was Spanish territory. And finally, the northwest part of the continent, which was claimed by the British and the Spanish, but with a small Russian presence. This 1802 map shows North America with the United States limited to east of the Mississippi. Just the next year, the United States acquired its first trans-Mississippi lands. On April 30th, 1803, the United States purchased the French Louisiana Territory, consisting of the lands extending west of the Mississippi River to the crest of the Rocky Mountains. Napoleon sold primarily because he needed money for his wars in Europe. The price tag was $15 million, or about $220 million in today's money. At the time, this was less than 3 cents per acre. This purchase essentially doubled the size of the United States. The borders for the Louisiana Territory were settled with the British at the 49th parallel by the Convention of 1818, and with the Spanish by the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, which settled the border in the southwest and which also limited Spanish claims to below the 42nd parallel. Within a year of the Louisiana Purchase, the process of breaking up this vast new U.S. territory into smaller political units was begun. In 1804, the Territory of Orleans was created out of the relatively settled part of the Purchase, which was the home of mainly a French population. The rest of the Purchase became the Louisiana Territory. Less than a decade later, in 1812, the Orleans Territory was made into the state of Louisiana, with what had been the Louisiana Territory, now the Missouri Territory. The creation of the state of Louisiana was intended mostly to balance the Free State of Ohio, which had been admitted in 1803, with a new slave state. In 1800, the number of free states in the United States was matched by the number of slave states. As the population of the North began to outstrip that in the South, leading to control of the House of Representatives by Northerners, Southerners began to focus on the need to keep the number of free and slave states balanced so they would not also lose power in the Senate. This remained a driving concern for Southerners for the next 6 decades, playing a huge role in how the borders of the West were drawn. Beginning in 1818, Americans who had settled west of the Mississippi River around St. Louis petitioned the United States government to carve a state for them out of the Missouri Territory. Their petition included the establishment of a southern border at the parallel of 36 degrees 30 minutes, which was the same latitude as the borders of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia and North Carolina. However, the settlers were mostly slaveholders, and because Northerners in Congress were loath to add a new slave state out of the Missouri Territory, their petition was not acted on right away. It did seem, however, that eventually a new state would be created there, and this left a gap between Louisiana and the proposed state of Missouri. So, in 1819, Congress created the Arkansas Territory in this space, using the 36 degree 30 minute parallel as its northern border. The agitation of the settlers around St. Louis to create a state came to fruition in 1820 with the creation of the state of Missouri by means of the Missouri Compromise. Maine had been clamoring to come in as a new state. It had hitherto been part of Massachusetts, but Southern congressmen demanded a new slave state to match, so a compromise was reached allowing Missouri to come in as a slave state at the same time as Maine was admitted as a free state. As planned, Missouri was admitted with its southern border along the Arkansas Territory at 36 degrees 30 minutes. That is, except for the Missouri Boot Hill, where the border goes down to the 36th parallel from the St. Francis River east of the Mississippi. Now, there are a number of purported reasons for the Missouri Boot Hill. Supposedly, a local resident asked to remain in Missouri because, quote, he had heard it was so sickly in Arkansas, full of bears and panthers and copperhead snakes, so it ain't safe for civilized people to stay there overnight even. Another story had it that a love-struck surveyor ran the line further south to spare the feelings of a widow living 50 miles south of the 3630 line, but who was unaware she might not be in the new state of Missouri. Actually, the Missouri Boot Heel was a result of the efforts of one John Hardiman Walker, who was the largest landowner in the area, known as the Czar of the Valley, who wanted his lands to be part of Missouri. His influence swayed Congress to add the boot to the new state. The Missouri Compromise brought matching free and slave states into the United States, but there was another equally important part of the compromise. This was to limit any new slave states excepting Missouri to being south of the 3630-degree line, no slavery being allowed north of that line. A few years later, in 1824 to 28, the western part of the Arkansas Territory was broken off so as to create lands reserved for Native Americans. This caused Arkansas Territory to be reduced to just the eastern part south of the new state of Missouri. This introduces the notion of Indian Territory within the boundaries of the United States. From the earliest days of European settlement, Indians had been, quote, removed from their lands and forced to move west. This was but the start of a long series of cases where Euro-Americans decided Indian lands were useful to them, so they forced the Native Americans out of those lands and pushed them further and further west. This culminated in the 1834 Indian Intercourse Act, when the Indians were given, quote, all that part of the United States west of the Mississippi and not within the states of Missouri and Louisiana or the territory of Arkansas. This was officially unorganized territory set aside solely for the use of the Indians. Notably, these lands were at the outer edge of the country, which conveniently provided a buffer between the states and Spanish territory. Much of this region had been named by Stephen Long as, quote, a great desert, and it was described on this 1833 map as, quote, this district is a vast wilderness of immense plains and meadows interspersed with barren hills and almost destitute of wood. That is, these lands were considered to be of no use to anyone, and so good enough for the Indians. However, as time passed, Euro-Americans expanded into these, quote, unsettled lands, which were actually quite fecund, and as that happened, the Indian rights were taken away, sometimes by treaty and often by force. Much of the history of the Western United States for the rest of the century was a whittling down of these Indian lands to a much reduced stump. Actually, right from the beginning, not all of this land was given to the Indians, despite what the Indian Intercourse Act said. In the early 1830s, the federal government was claiming lands in western Illinois, where the Sauk Indians were located. In the 1832 Black Hawk War, Black Hawk led the Sauk in a fight to retain their lands in western Illinois. In 1833, the Sauk lost the war and were forced to give up not only their Illinois lands, but also a strip of land west of the Mississippi in today's eastern Iowa. This is called the Black Hawk Purchase. Euro-Americans poured into and beyond these new lands, both for farming and for mining lead, and so in 1837 there was a second Black Hawk Purchase of more lands to the west. Finally, in 1838, all the land north of Missouri between the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers was created as the Iowa Territory, though the Indians did retain some land there as reservations. So, to summarize, by 1844, in the old Louisiana Purchase, the lands along the Mississippi River had been broken up into smaller units, with two states, Louisiana and Missouri, and two territories, Arkansas and Iowa. The rest of the original purchase, up to the Continental Divide, was still unorganized Indian territory. I believe that it is important to understand the changes we have looked at in this lecture. One cannot understand the history of our country without understanding the history of the political changes in the American West. In this lecture, we saw various factors at play. There was the desire for expansion of the country's borders, for settlement and economic exploitation. We saw the desire of Westerners to have local control by creating states for themselves. We saw the Native Americans being pushed to lands that were not thought to be terribly useful to, quote, Americans, and we saw how when the Americans changed their mind, they just took the land away. Finally, we saw how the issue of slavery was one of the most important considerations in the shaping of the American West, with Louisiana gaining statehood to balance off the free state of Ohio, and with the creation of Missouri only accomplished when the free state of Maine was admitted at the same time. This period also introduced a political feature which played a major role in the shaping of the American West in the future. That is, the establishment of the 3630 latitude line as the northern limit of slavery for any new territories or states to be created in the Louisiana Purchase. Thank you for watching this Philadelphia Print Shop online lecture, the first in our series, The Shaping of the American West. We hope you found it interesting and informative. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. If you would like to see a selection of original antique maps, please visit our website at pps-west.com.